Wacko Siege. The Wacko Siege, also known as the Waco Massacre, was the law enforcement siege of the compound that belonged to the religious sect Branch Davidians. It was carried out by the U.S. federal government, Texas state law enforcement, and the U.S. military between February 28 and April 19, 1993. The Branch Davidians were led by David Koresh, and were headquartered at Mount Carmel Center Ranch in the community of Axtell, Texas, 13 miles 21 kilometers northeast of Waco. Suspecting the group of stockpiling illegal weapons, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms ATF obtained a search warrant for the compound and arrest warrants for Koresh as well as a select few of the group's members. The incident began when the ATF attempted to serve a search and arrest warrant on the ranch. An intense gunfight erupted, resulting in the deaths of 4 government agents and 6 Branch Davidians. Upon the ATF entering of the property and failure to execute the search warrant, a siege lasting 51 days was initiated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI). Eventually, the FBI launched an assault and initiated a tear gas attack in an attempt to force the Branch Davidians out of the ranch. Shortly thereafter, the Mount Carmel Center became engulfed in flames. The fire resulted in the deaths of 76 Branch Davidians, including 25 children, 2 pregnant women, and David Koresh himself. The events of the siege and attack are disputed by various sources. A particular controversy ensued over the origin of the fire. An internal Justice Department investigation concluded in 2000 that incendiary tear gas canisters were used by the FBI, but maintained that sect members had started the fire. This came after a panel of arson investigators concluded that the Davidians were responsible for igniting it simultaneously in at least 3 different areas of the compound. The events near Waco, along with the law enforcement siege at Ruby Ridge less than 12 months earlier, have been cited by commentators as catalysts for the Oklahoma City bombing by Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols. Background. The Branch Davidians, also known as the Branch, are a religious group that originated in 1955 from a schism in the Shepherd's Rod Davidians following the death of the Shepherd's Rod founder Victor Atf. Atf founded the Davidians based on his prophecy of an imminent apocalypse involving the second coming of Jesus Christ and the defeat of the evil armies of Babylon. As the original Davidian group gained members, its leadership moved the church to a hilltop several miles east of Waco, Texas, which they named Mount Carmel, after a mountain in Israel mentioned in Joshua 19:26 in the Bible's Old Testament. A few years later, they moved again to a much larger site east of the city. In 1959, Victor's widow, Florence Atf, announced that the expected Armageddon was about to take place, and members were told to gather at the center to await this event. Many of them built houses, others stayed in tents, trucks, or buses, and most of them sold their possessions. Following the failure of this prophecy, control of the site Mount Carmel Center fell to Benjamin Roden, founder of the Branch Davidian Seventh-day Adventist Association Branch Davidians. He promoted different doctrinal beliefs than those of Victor Atf's original Davidian Seventh-day Adventist organization. On Roden's death, control of the Branch Davidians fell to his wife, Lois Roden. Lois considered their son, George Roden, unfit to assume the position of prophet. Instead, she groomed Vernon Wayne Howell, later known as David Koresh, to be her successor. In 1984, a meeting led to a division of the group, with Howell leading one faction calling themselves the Branch Davidians and George Roden leading the competing faction. After this split, George Roden ran Howell and his followers off Mount Carmel at gunpoint. Howell and his group relocated to Palestine, Texas. After the death of Lois Roden and probate of her estate in January 1987, Howell attempted to gain control of Mount Carmel Center by force. George Roden had dug up the casket of one Anna Hughes from the Davidian cemetery and had challenged Howell to a resurrection contest to prove who was the rightful heir to the leadership. Howell instead went to the police and claimed Roden was guilty of corpse abuse, but the county prosecutors refused to file charges without proof. On November 3, 1987, Howell and 7 armed companions tried to get into the Mount Carmel chapel, intending to photograph the body in the casket as incriminating evidence. Roden was informed of the interlopers and opened fire. The sheriff's department responded about 20 minutes into the gunfight, during which Roden had been wounded. Sheriff Harwell got Howell on the phone and told him to stop shooting and surrender. Howell and his companions, dubbed the Rodenville Eight by the media, were tried for attempted murder on April 12, 1988. 7 were acquitted, and the jury hung on Howell's verdict. The county prosecutors did not press the case further. Even with all the effort to bring the casket to court, the standing judge refused to use it as evidence for the case. Judge Herman Fitz ruled that the courtroom is no place for a casket when defense attorney Gary Coker requested it be used as evidence for the case. During questions about the casket, Roden admitted to attempting to resurrect and Hughes on 3 occasions. The Rodenville Eight were forced to carry the casket down the street to a van awaiting the body. While waiting for the trial, Roden was put in jail under contempt of court charges because of his use of foul language in some court pleadings. He threatened the Texas court with sexually transmitted diseases if the court ruled in Howell's favor. Alongside these charges, Roden was jailed for 6 months for legal motions he filed with explicit language. Roden faced 90 days in jail for living on the property after being ordered to neither live on the property nor call himself the leader of the religious group in a 1979 case. The next day, Perry Jones and several of Howell's other followers moved from their headquarters in Palestine, Texas, to Mount Carmel. In mid-Minus 1989, Roden used an axe to kill a Davidian named Wayman Dale Adair, who visited him to discuss Adair's alleged vision of being God's chosen Messiah. He was found guilty under an insanity defense and was committed to a mental hospital. Shortly after Roden's commitment, Howell raised money to pay off all the back taxes on Mount Carmel owed by Roden and took legal control of the property. After these legal proceedings, it was noted in a 90-minute interview by the Davidians' attorney Douglas Martin that the religious group had been back and forth to court since 1955. On August 5, 1989, Howell released the new light audio tape, in which he said that God told him to procreate with the women in the group to establish a house of David, of his special people. This involved separating married couples in the group, who had to agree that only he could have sexual relations with the wives, while the men should observe celibacy. Howell also said that God had told him to start building an army for God to prepare for the end of days and a salvation for his followers. Howell filed a petition in the California State Superior Court in Pomona on May 15, 1990, to legally change his name for publicity and business purposes to David Koresh. On August 28, he was granted the petition. By 1992, most of the land belonging to the group had been sold except for a core 77 acres 31 ha. Most of the buildings had been removed or were being salvaged for construction materials to convert much of the main chapel and a tall water tank into apartments for the resident members of the group. Many of the members of the group had been involved with the Davidians for a few generations, and many had large families. Prelude. On February 27, 1993, the Waco Tribune-Herald began publishing The Sinful Messiah, a series of articles by Mark England and Darlene McCormick, who reported allegations that Koresh had physically abused children in the compound and had committed statutory rape by taking multiple underage brides. Koresh was also said to advocate polygamy for himself and declared himself married to several female residents of the small community. The paper claimed that Koresh had announced he was entitled to at least 140 wives and that he was entitled to claim any of the women in the group as his, that he had fathered at least a dozen children, and that some of these mothers became brides as young as 12 or 13 years old. In addition to allegations of sexual abuse and misconduct, Koresh and his followers were suspected of stockpiling illegal weapons. In May 1992, Chief Deputy Daniel Weyenberg of the McLennan County Sheriff's Department called the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms (ATF) to notify them that his office had been contacted by a local UPS representative concerned about a report by a local driver. The UPS driver said a package had broken open on delivery to the Branch Davidian residence, revealing firearms, inert grenade casings, and black powder. On June 9, the ATF opened a formal investigation, and a week later it was classified as sensitive, thereby calling for a high degree of oversight from both Houston and headquarters. The documentary Inside Waco claims that the investigation started when in 1992 the ATF became concerned over reports of automatic gunfire coming from the Carmel compound. On July 30, ATF agents David Aguilera and Skinner visited the Branch Davidians gun dealer Henry McMahon, who tried to get them to talk with Koresh on the phone. Koresh offered to let ATF inspect the Branch Davidians' weapons and paperwork and asked to speak with Aguilera, but Aguilera declined. Sheriff Harwell told reporters, regarding law enforcement talking with Koresh, just go out and talk to them. What's wrong with notifying them? The ATF began surveillance from a house across the road from the compound several months before the siege. Their cover was noticeably poor. The college students were in their 30s, had new cars, were not registered at the local schools, and did not keep a schedule that would have fit any legitimate employment or classes. The investigation included sending in an undercover agent, Robert Rodriguez, whose identity Koresh learned, though he chose not to reveal that fact until the day of the raid. The ATF obtained a search warrant on suspicion that the Davidians were modifying guns to have illegal automatic fire capability. Former Branch Davidian Mark Brolt claimed that Koresh had M16 lower receiver parts combining M16 trigger components with a modified AR-15 lower receiver is, according to ATF regulations, constructive possession of an unregistered machine gun, regulated in the Firearm Owners Protection Act of 1986. The Aguilera Affidavit. The ATF used an affidavit filed by David Aguilera to obtain the warrant that led to the Wacko Siege. The official filing date of this affidavit was February 25, 1993. Allegedly, the initial investigation began in June 1992, when a postal worker informed a sheriff of McLennan County that he believed he had been delivering explosives to the ammo and gun store owned and operated by the Branch Day. This store, named the Mag Bag, had been identified by the said postal worker as suspicious in deliveries. The postal worker continued deliveries to the Mount Carmel Center and reported seeing manned observation posts. In the affidavit, it states he believed there were armed personnel at these observation posts. The McLennan County Sheriff was notified in May and June of that year of 2 cases of inert grenades, black gunpowder, 90 pounds of powdered aluminum metal, and 30-40 cardboard tubes. Furthermore, the sheriff noticed another shipment of 60 AR-15/M-16 Stannig magazines, to which Aguilera made the statement, "I have been involved in many cases where defendants, following a relatively simple process, convert AR-15 semi-automatic rifles to fully automatic rifles of the nature of the M-16. In November 1992, a local farmer reported to the sheriff that he had heard machine gun fire. By the sound of it, he said, it was likely a .50 caliber machine gun and multiple M-16s. This farmer claimed he was very familiar with machine guns, having done a tour overseas in the U.S. Army. The affidavit closed with Aguilera verifying the story via interviews made with associated parties and gun shops from which the Mag Bag purchased items. Among these items were over 45 AR-15 upper receivers and 5 M-16 upper receivers, which Aguilera annotated. These kits contain all the parts of an M-16 except for the lower receiver unit, which is the firearm by lawful definition, admitting that neither the noise complaints nor the items ordered were necessarily. ATF Raid Preparations. Using the affidavit filed by Aguilera that alleged that the Davidians had violated federal law, The ATF obtained search and arrest warrants for Koresh and specific followers on weapons charges, citing the many firearms they had accumulated. The search warrant commanded a search on or before February 28, 1993, in the daytime between 6:00 am and 10:00 p.m. The ATF made a claim that Koresh was possibly operating a methamphetamine lab to establish a drug nexus and obtain military assets under the war on drugs. Although the ATF investigation focused on firearm violations, not on illegal drugs, the ATF requested assistance from the DEA and the DoD, citing a drug connection based on 1. A recent delivery to the compound of chemicals, instruments, and glassware. 2. A written testimony from a former compound resident alleging Howell had told him that drug trafficking was a desirable way to raise money. 3. Several current residents who had prior drug involvement. 4. 2 former residents who were incarcerated for drug trafficking crimes. And 5. National Guard overflights thermal images showing a hot spot inside the compound, possibly indicating a methamphetamine laboratory. Although the original request for assistance was initially approved, the commander of the Special Forces Detachment questioned the request, and the ATF obtained only a training site at Fort Hood, Texas, from February 25 to February 27. The ATF had planned their raid for Monday, March 1, 1993, with the code name Showtime. The ATF later claimed that the raid was moved up a day to February 28, 1993, in response to the Waco Tribune-Herald's The Sinful Messiah series of articles which the ATF had tried to prevent from being published. Beginning February 1, ATF agents had 3 meetings with Tribune-Herald staff regarding a delay in publication of The Sinful Messiah. The paper was first told by the ATF that the raid would take place February 22, which they changed to March 1, and then ultimately to an indefinite date. ATF agents felt the newspaper had held off publication at the request of the ATF for at least 3 weeks. In a February 24 meeting between Tribune-Herald staff and ATF agent Philip Chajanki and 2 other agents, the ATF could not give the newspaper staff a clear idea of what action was planned or when. The Tribune-Herald informed ATF they were publishing the series, which included an editorial calling for local authorities to act. Personnel of the Tribune-Herald found out about the imminent raid after the first installment of The Sinful Messiah had already appeared on February 27. Although the ATF preferred to arrest Koresh when he was outside Mount Carmel, planners received inaccurate information that Koresh rarely left it. The Branch Davidian members were well known locally and had cordial relations with other locals. The Branch Davidians partly supported themselves by trading at gun shows and took care to have the relevant paperwork to ensure their transactions were legal. Branch Davidian Paul Fatta was a federal firearms licensed dealer, and the group operated a retail gun business called the Mag Bag. When shipments for the Mag Bag arrived, they were signed for by Fatta Steve Schroeder or Koresh, 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 or Koresh. The morning of the raid, Paul Fatta and his son Kalani were on their way to an Austin gun show to conduct business. February 28. The ATF attempted to execute their search warrant on Sunday morning, February 28, 1993. The local sheriff, in audio tapes broadcast after the incident, said he was not apprised of the raid. Despite being informed that the Branch Davidians knew a raid was coming, the ATF commander ordered that it go ahead, even though their plan depended on reaching the compound without the Branch Davidians being armed and prepared. While not standard procedure, ATF agents had their blood type written on their arms or neck after leaving the staging area and before the raid, because it was recommended by the military to facilitate speedy blood transfusions in the case of injury. Any advantage of surprise was lost when a KWTX-TV reporter who had been tipped off about the raid asked for directions from a U.S. Postal Service mail carrier, who was coincidentally Koresh's brother-in-law. Koresh then told undercover ATF agent Robert Rodriguez that they knew a raid was imminent. Rodriguez had infiltrated the Branch Davidians and was astonished to find that his cover had been blown. The agent made an excuse and left the compound. When asked later what the Branch Davidians had been doing when he left the compound, Rodriguez replied, "They were praying." Branch Davidian survivors have written that Koresh ordered selected male followers to begin arming and taking up defensive positions, while the women and children were told to take cover in their rooms. Koresh told them he would try to speak to the agents, and what happened next would depend on the agents' intentions. The ATF arrived at 9:45 am in a convoy of civilian vehicles containing uniformed personnel in SWAT-style tactical gear. ATF agents stated that they heard shots coming from within the compound, while Branch Davidian survivors claimed that the first shots came from the ATF agents outside. A suggested reason may have been an accidental discharge of a weapon, possibly by an ATF agent, causing the ATF to respond with fire from automatic weapons. Other reports claim the first shots were fired by the ATF dog team sent to kill the dogs in the Branch Davidian kennel. 3 helicopters of the Army National Guard were used as an aerial distraction, and all took incoming fire. During the first shots, Koresh was wounded, shot in the hand and the stomach. Within a minute of the raid's start, Branch Davidian Wayne Martin called emergency services, pleading for them to stop shooting. Martin asked for a ceasefire, and audio tapes record him saying, "Here they come again," and "That's them shooting. That's not us." The first ATF casualty. Agents quickly took cover and fired at the buildings while the helicopters began their diversion and swept in low over the complex, 350 feet, 105 m away from the building. The Branch Davidians fired on the helicopters and hit them, although none of the crew members were injured. In response, the helicopter pilots chose to pull away from the compound and land. On the east side of the compound, agents brought out 2 ladders and set them against the side of the building. They then climbed onto the roof to secure it to reach Koresh's room and the location where they believed weapons were stored. On the west slope of the roof, 3 agents reached Koresh's window and were crouching beside it when they came under fire. 1 agent was killed and another wounded. The 3rd agent clambered over the peak of the roof and joined other agents attempting to enter the armory. The window was smashed, a flashbang stun grenade was thrown in, and 3 agents entered the armory. When another tried to follow them, a hail of bullets penetrated the wall and wounded him, but he was able to reach a ladder and slide to safety. An agent fired his shotgun at Branch Davidians until he was hit in the head by returned fire and killed. Inside the armory, the agents killed a Branch Davidian and discovered a cache of weapons, but subsequently came under heavy fire. 2 were wounded. As they escaped, the 3rd agent laid down covering fire, killing a Branch Davidian. As he made his escape, he hit his head on a wooden support beam and fell off the roof but survived. An agent outside provided them with covering fire but was shot by a Branch Davidian and killed instantly. Dozens of ATF agents took cover, many behind Branch Davidian vehicles, and exchanged fire with the Branch Davidians. The number of ATF wounded increased, and an agent was killed by gunfire from the compound as agents were firing at a Branch Davidian perched on top of the water tower. The exchange of fire continued, but 45 minutes into the raid the gunfire began to slow down as agents began to run low on ammunition. The shooting continued for a total of 2 hours. Sheriff Lieutenant Lynch of the McLennan County Sheriff Department contacted the ATF and negotiated a ceasefire. Sheriff Harwell states in William Gayski's documentary Waco, The Rules of Engagement, that the ATF agents withdrew only after they were out of ammunition. ATF agent Chuck Huskmeyer later wrote, about 45 minutes into the shootout, the volume of gunfire finally started to slacken. We were running out of ammunition. The Davidians, however, had plenty. In all, 4 ATF agents, Steve Willies, Robert Williams, Todd McKeehan, and Conway Charles LeBlieu, had been killed during the firefight. Another 16 had been injured. After the ceasefire, the Branch Davidians allowed the ATF dead and wounded to be evacuated and held their fire during the ATF retreat. The 5 Branch Davidians killed in the raid were Winston Blake, Peter Gent, Peter Hipsman, Perry Jones, and Jadian Wendell. 2 were killed at the hands of the Branch Davidians after having been wounded. Their bodies were buried on the grounds. Nearly 6 hours after the 11:30 am ceasefire, Michael Schroeder was shot dead by ATF agents who alleged he fired a pistol at agents as he attempted to re-enter the compound with Woodrow Kendrick and Norman Allison. Alan A. Stone's report states that the Branch Davidians did not ambush the ATF and that they apparently did not maximize the kill of ATF agents, explaining that they were rather desperate religious fanatics expecting an apocalyptic ending, in which they were destined to die defending their sacred ground and destined to achieve salvation. A 1999 federal report noted, "The violent tendencies of dangerous cults can be classified into 2 general categories: defensive violence and offensive violence. Defensive violence is utilized by cults to defend a compound or enclave that was created specifically to eliminate most contact with the dominant culture." The 1993 clash in Waco, Texas at the Branch Davidian complex is an illustration of such defensive violence. History has shown that groups that seek to withdraw from the dominant culture seldom act on their beliefs that the end time has come unless provoked. FBI siege, final assault and burning of Mount Carmel. Newly appointed U.S. Attorney General Janet Reno approved recommendations by the FBI hostage rescue team to mount an assault after being told that conditions were deteriorating and that children were being abused inside the compound. Reno made the FBI case to President Clinton, recalling the April 19, 1985, the Covenant Sword, and the Arm of the Lord Cecil siege in Arkansas, which was ended without loss of life by a blockade without a deadline. President Clinton suggested similar tactics against the Branch Davidians. Reno countered that the FBI hostage rescue team was tired of waiting, that the standoff was costing $1 million per week, that the Branch Davidians could hold out longer than the Cecil, and that the chances of child sexual abuse and mass suicide were imminent. Clinton later recounted, "Finally, I told her that if she thought it was the right thing to do, she could go ahead." Over the next several months, Janet Reno's reason for approving the final gas attack varied from her initial claim that the FBI hostage rescue team had told her that Koresh was sexually abusing children and beating babies. The FBI hostage rescue. Because the Branch Davidians were heavily armed, the FBI hostage rescue team's arms included 50 caliber 12.7 mm rifles and armored combat engineering vehicles (CV). The CV used explosives to punch holes in the walls of buildings of the compound so they could pump in CS gas, tear gas, and try to force the Branch Davidians out without harming them. The stated plan called for increasing amounts of gas to be pumped in over 2 days to increase pressure. Officially, no armed assault was to be made. Loudspeakers were to be used to tell the Branch Davidians that there would be no armed assault and to ask them not to fire on the vehicles. According to the FBI, hostage rescue team agents had been permitted to return any incoming fire, but no shots were fired by federal agents on April 19. When several Branch Davidians opened fire, the FBI hostage rescue team's response was only to increase the amount of gas being used. The FBI hostage rescue team delivered 40mm, 1.6 in CS grenade fire from M79 grenade launchers. Very early in the morning, the FBI hostage rescue team fired 2 military M651 rounds at the Branch Davidian construction site. Around mid-morning, the FBI hostage rescue team began to run low on 40mm Ferret CS rounds and asked Texas Ranger Captain David Byans for tear gas rounds. The tear gas rounds procured from Company F in Waco turned out to be unusable pyrotechnic and were returned to the Company F office afterward. 40 munitions recovered by the Texas Rangers at Waco included dozens of plastic ferret model SG Aminus 400 liquid CS rounds, two metal M651 Eon military pyrotechnic tear gas rounds, two metal Nico pyrotechnic sound and flash grenades, and parachute illumination flares. After more than 6 hours, no Branch Davidians had left the building, sheltering instead in an underground concrete block room, the bunker, within the building, or using gas masks. At around noon, 3 fires broke out almost simultaneously in different parts of the building and spread quickly. Footage of the blaze was broadcast live by television crews. The government maintains the fires were deliberately started by the Branch Davidians. Some Branch Davidian survivors maintain that the fires were accidentally or deliberately started by the assault. Only 9 people left the building during the fire. The remaining Branch Davidians, including the children, were either buried alive by rubble, suffocated, or shot. Many were killed by smoke or carbon monoxide inhalation and other causes as fire engulfed the building. According to the FBI, Steve Schneider, Koresh's top aide, shot and killed Koresh and then himself. In all, 76 people died. A large concentration of bodies, weapons, and ammunition was found in the bunker's storage room. The Texas Rangers arson investigator report assumes that many of the occupants were either denied escape from within or refused to leave until escape was not an option. It also mentions that the structural debris from the breaching operations on the west end of the building could have blocked a possible escape route through the tunnel system. An independent investigation by 2 experts from the University of Maryland's Department of Fire Protection Engineering concluded that the compound residents had sufficient time to escape the fire if they had so desired. Autopsies of the dead revealed that some women and children found beneath a fallen concrete wall of a storage room died of skull injuries. Autopsy photographs of other children locked in what appear to be spasmic death poses are consistent with cyanide poisoning, one of the results produced by burning CS gas. The U.S. Department of Justice report indicated that only one body had traces of benzene, one of the components of solvent dispersed CS gas, but that the gas insertions had finished nearly 1 hour before the fire started, and that it was enough time for solvents to dissipate from the bodies of the Branch Davidians that had inhaled the tear gas. Autopsy records also indicate that at least 20 Branch Davidians were shot, including Koresh, as well as 5 children under the age of 14. 3-year-old Dalen Gent was stabbed in the chest. The medical examiner who performed the autopsies believed these deaths were mercy killings by the Branch Davidians trapped in the fire with no escape. The expert retained by the U.S. Office of Special Counsel concluded that many of the gunshot wounds support self-destruction either by overt suicide, consensual execution, suicide by proxy, or less likely forced execution. Chronology of events of April 19. Aftermath. The new ATF director, John McVeigh, criticized several aspects of the ATF raid. McVeigh made the Treasury Blue Book report on Waco required reading for new agents. A 1995 Government Accountability Office report on the use of force by federal law enforcement agencies observed that on the basis of Treasury's report on the Waco operation and views of tactical operations, ATF decided in October 1995 that dynamic entry would only be planned after all other options have been considered and began. Only a small chapel, built years after the siege, stands on the site. Trial and imprisonments of Branch Davidians. The events at Mount Carmel spurred both criminal prosecution and civil litigation. On August 3, 1993, a federal grand jury returned a superseding 10-count indictment against 12 of the surviving Branch Davidians. The grand jury charged, among other things, that the Branch Davidians had conspired to and aided and abetted in the murder of federal officers and had unlawfully possessed and used various firearms. The government dismissed the charges against one of the 12 Branch Davidians according to a plea bargain. after a jury trial lasting nearly 2 months, the jury acquitted 4 of the Branch Davidians on all charges. Additionally, the jury acquitted all of the Branch Davidians on the murder-related charges, but convicted 5 of them on lesser charges, including aiding and abetting the voluntary manslaughter of federal agents. 8 Branch Davidians were convicted on firearms charges. The convicted Branch Davidians who received sentences of up to 40 years were Kevin A. Whitecliff, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Jane Castello, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Paul Gordon Feta, convicted of conspiracy to possess machine guns and aiding Branch Davidian leader David Koresh in possessing machine guns; Reno's Lenny Avram, British national, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Graham Leonard Craddock, Australian national, convicted of possessing a grenade and using or possessing a firearm during a crime; Brad Eugene Branch, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Livingstone Fagan, British national, convicted of voluntary manslaughter and using a firearm during a crime; Ruth Riddle, Canadian national, convicted of using or carrying a weapon during a crime; Catherine Schroeder, sentenced to 3 years after pleading guilty to a reduced charge of forcibly resisting arrest. 6 of the 8 Branch Davidians appealed both their sentences and their convictions. They raised a host of issues, challenging the constitutionality of the prohibition on possession of machine guns, the jury instructions, the district court's conduct of the trial, the sufficiency of the evidence, and the sentences imposed. The United States Court of Appeals for the Fifth Circuit vacated the defendants' sentences for use of machine guns, determining that the district court had made no finding that they had actively employed the weapons, but left the verdicts undisturbed in all other respects. In United States v. Branch, 91 F. 3 699 5th Sir, 1990, denied 1997. On remand, the district court found that the defendants had actively employed machine guns and resentenced 5 of them to substantial prison terms. The defendants again appealed. The Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals affirmed. The Branch Davidians pressed this issue before the United States Supreme Court. The Supreme Court reversed, holding that the term machine gun in the relevant statute created an element of the offense to be determined by a jury, rather than a sentencing factor to be determined by a judge, as had happened in the trial court. On September 19, 2000, Judge Walter Smith followed the Supreme Court's instructions and cut 25 years from the sentences of 5 convicted Branch Davidians and 5 years from the sentence of another. All Branch Davidians have been released from prison as of July 2007. 33 British citizens were among the members of the Branch Davidians during the siege. 24 of them were among the 80 Branch Davidian fatalities in the raid of February 28 and the assault of April 19, including at least 1 child. 2 more British nationals who survived the siege were immediately arrested as material witnesses and imprisoned without trial for months. Derek Lovelock was held in McLennan County Jail for 7 months, often in solitary confinement. Livingstone Fagan, another British citizen, who was among those convicted and imprisoned, says he received multiple beatings at the hands of correctional officers, particularly at Leavenworth. There, Fagan claims to have been doused inside his cell with cold water from a high-pressure hose, after which an industrial fan was placed outside the cell, blasting him with cold air. Fagan was repeatedly moved between at least 9 different facilities. He was strip-searched every time he took exercise, so he refused exercise. Released and deported back to the UK in July 2007, he still retained his religious beliefs. Civil suits by Branch Davidians. Several of the surviving Branch Davidians, as well as more than 100 family members of those who had died or were injured in the confrontation, brought civil suits against the United States government, numerous federal officials, the former governor of Texas Ann Richards, and members of the Texas Army National Guard. They sought monetary damages under the Federal Tort Claims Act, civil rights statutes, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, and Texas state law. The bulk of these claims were dismissed because they were insufficient as a matter of law or because the plaintiffs could advance no material evidence in support of them. The court, after a month-long trial, rejected the Branch Davidians case. The court found that, on February 28, 1993, the Branch Davidians initiated a gun battle when they fired at federal officers who were attempting to serve lawful warrants. ATF agents returned gunfire to the building, the court ruled, to protect themselves and other agents from death or serious bodily harm. The court found that the government's planning of the siege, i.e., the decisions to use tear gas against the Branch Davidians, to insert the tear gas using military vehicles, and to omit specific planning for the possibility that a fire would erupt was a discretionary function for which the government could not be sued. The court also found that the use of tear gas was not negligent. Further, even if the United States government were negligent by causing damage to the buildings before the fires broke out, thus either blocking escape routes or enabling the fires to spread faster, the Branch Davidians appealed. They contended that the trial court judge, Walter S. Smith, Jr., should have recused himself from hearing their claims on account of his relationships with defendants, defense counsel, and court staff, prior judicial determinations, and comments during trial. The Fifth Circuit concluded that these allegations did not reflect conduct that would cause a reasonable observer to question Judge Smith's impartiality, and it affirmed the take-nothing judgment in Andrade v. Chodnacki, 338 F. 3 448 5th, Sir, 2003 Cert. Denied 2004. Controversies. Roland Ballesteros, one of the agents assigned to the ATF door team that assaulted the front door, told Texas Rangers and Waco police that he thought the first shots came from the ATF dog team assigned to neutralize the Branch Davidians' dogs, but later at the trial, he insisted that the Branch Davidians had shot first. The Branch Davidians claimed that the ATF door team then opened fire at the door, and they returned fire in self-defense. An Austin Chronicle article noted, long before the fire, the Davidians were discussing the evidence contained in the doors. During the siege, in a phone conversation with the FBI, Steve Schroeder, one of Koresh's main confidants, told FBI agents that the evidence from the front door will clearly show how many bullets and what happened. Houston attorney Dick DeGuerin, who went inside Mount Carmel during the siege, testified at the trial that protruding metal on the inside of the right-hand entry door made it clear that the bullet holes were made by incoming rounds. DeGuerin also testified that only the right-hand entry door had bullet holes, while the left-hand entry door was intact. The government presented the left-hand entry door at the trial, claiming that the right-hand entry door had been lost. The left-hand door contained numerous bullet holes made by both outgoing and incoming rounds. Texas Trooper Sergeant David Keyes testified that he witnessed two men loading what could have been the missing door into a U-Haul van shortly after the siege had ended, but he did not see the object itself. Michael Cadell, the lead attorney for the Branch Davidians' wrongful death lawsuit, explained, "The fact that the left-hand door is in the condition it's in tells you that the right-hand door was not consumed by the fire. It was lost on purpose by somebody." Cadell offered no evidence to support this allegation, which has never been proven. However, fire investigators stated that it was extremely unlikely that the steel right door could have suffered damage in the fire much greater than did the steel left door, and both doors would have been found together. The right door remains missing, and the entire site was under close supervision by law enforcement officials until the debris, including both doors, had been removed. Helicopters had been obtained from the Alabama and Texas National Guard on the false pretext that there was a drug laboratory at Mount Carmel. There were no drug-related charges on the arrest warrant served on the morning of February 28, 1993. The official version of events has always stated that the helicopters were merely used as a diversion, that the crew only had 9mm sidearms and that no shots were fired from them. In the weeks preceding the raid, Rick Ross, a self-described cult expert and a programmer affiliated with the Cult Awareness Network, appeared on major networks such as NBC and CBS in regard to Koresh, 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 to Koresh. Ross later described his role in advising authorities about the Davidians and Koresh, and what actions should be taken to end the siege. He was quoted as saying that he was consulted by the ATF and he contacted the FBI on March 4, 1993, requesting that he be interviewed regarding his knowledge of cults in general and the Branch Davidians in particular. The FBI reports that it did not rely on Ross for advice whatsoever during the standoff, but that it did an interview and received input from him. Ross also telephoned the FBI on March 27 and March 28, offering advice about negotiation strategies, suggesting that the FBI attempt to embarrass Koresh by informing other members of the compound about Koresh's faults and failures in life, in order to convince them that Koresh was not the prophet they had been led to believe. The ATF also contacted Ross in January 1993 for information about Koresh. Several writers have documented the Cult Awareness Network's role about the government's decision-making concerning Waco. Mark McWilliams notes that several studies have shown how self-styled cult experts like Ross and to cult organizations like the Cult Awareness Network can, and disaffected Branch Davidian defectors like Brolt played important roles in popularizing a harshly negative image of Koresh as a dangerous cult leader, portrayed as self-obsessed, egomaniacal. According to religious scholars Philip Arnold and James Tabor, who made an effort to help resolve the conflict, the crisis need not have ended tragically if only the FBI had been more open to religious studies and better able to distinguish between the dubious ideas of Ross and the scholarly expertise. In a New Yorker article in 2014, Malcolm Gladwell, they made an audio tape, which they played for Koresh, and which seemed to convince him. However, the FBI waited only 3 days before beginning the assault, instead of an estimated 2 weeks for Koresh to complete a manuscript sparked by this alternative interpretation and then come out peacefully. An article by Stuart A. Wright published in Nova Religio discussed how the FBI mishandled the siege, stating that there is no greater example of misfeasance than the failure of the Federal Bureau of Investigation (FBI) to bring about a bloodless resolution to the 51-day standoff. Some of Wright's major concerns about the operation include that the FBI officials, especially Dick Rogers, behaved increasingly aggressively and impatiently when the conflict could have been resolved by more peaceful negotiation. He mentions that Rogers said in an interview with the FBI that when we started depriving them, we were really driving people closer to him Koresh because of their devotion to him, which was different from what he said in the Department of Justice report. Critics suggest that, during the final raid, the CS gas was injected into the building by armored vehicles in an unsafe manner, which could have started a fire. While 2 of the 3 fires were started well inside the building, away from where the CS gas was pumped in, survivor David Koresh claimed in a 1999 interview with Reason that damage to the building allowed the gas to spread, stating, "They started to break the walls, break the windows down." The further controversy involves the use of gas grenades. Attorney General Reno had specifically directed that no pyrotechnic devices be used in the assault. Between 1993 and 1999, FBI spokesmen denied even under oath the use of any sort of pyrotechnic devices during the assault. However, pyrotechnic flight right CS gas grenades had been found in the rubble immediately following the fire. In 1999, FBI spokesmen were forced to admit that they had used the grenades. However, they claimed that these devices, which dispense CS gas through an internal burning process, had been used during an early morning attempt to penetrate a covered, water-filled construction pit 40 yards 35 m away and were not fired into the building. According to FBI claims, the fires started approximately 3 hours after the grenades had been fired. When the FBI documents were turned over to Congress for an investigation in 1994, the page listing the use of the pyrotechnic devices was missing. The failure for 6 years to disclose the use of pyrotechnics despite her specific directive led Reno to demand an investigation. A senior FBI official told Newsweek that as many as 100 FBI agents had known about the use of pyrotechnics, but no one spoke up until 1999. In a 2020 podcast with Harry Robinson, Thibodeau claimed that 7 pyrotechnic devices were found by the Branch Davidians in the areas where the fires started, but were misidentified by the government as silencers. On May 12, less than a month after the incident, Texas state authorities bulldozed the site, rendering further gathering of forensic evidence impossible. The FBI had planted surveillance devices in the walls of the building, which captured several conversations the government claims are evidence that the Davidians started the fire. At 287, the recordings were imperfect and many times difficult to understand, and the 2 transcriptions that were made had differences at many points. At 287, according to reporter Diana Fewens, when the FBI April 19 tapes were played in court during the Branch Davidian trials, few people heard what the FBI audio expert claimed to hear. The tapes were filled with noise and voices only occasionally were discernible. The words were faint. Some courtroom observers said they heard. The Branch Davidians had given ominous warnings involving a fire on several occasions. This may or may not have been indicative of the Branch Davidians' future actions, but was the basis for the conclusion of Congress that the fire was started by the Branch Davidians absent any other potential source of ignition. This was before the FBI admission that pyrotechnics were used, but a year-long investigation by the Office of the Special Counsel after that admission nonetheless reached the same conclusion, and no further congressional investigations followed. During a 1999 deposition for civil suits by Branch Davidian survivors, fire survivor Graham Cradick was interviewed. He stated that he saw some Branch Davidians moving about a dozen 1-gallon 3.8L cans of fuel so they would not be run over by armored vehicles, heard talk of pouring fuel outside the building, and, after the fire had started, something that sounded like light the fire from another individual. Professor Kenneth Newport's book The Branch Davidians of Waco attempts to prove that starting the fire themselves was pre-planned and consistent with the Branch Davidians' theology. He cites as evidence conversations the FBI recorded during the siege, testimonials of survivors Clive Doyle and Graham Cradick, and the buying of diesel fuel 1 month before the start of the siege. The FBI received contradictory reports on the possibility of Koresh's suicide and was not sure about whether he would commit suicide. The evidence made them believe that there was no possibility of mass suicide, with Koresh and Schroeder repeatedly denying to the negotiators that they had plans to commit mass suicide, and people leaving the compound saying that they had seen no preparations for such a thing. There was a possibility that some of his followers would join Koresh if he decided to commit suicide. According to Alan A. Stone's report, during the siege the FBI used an incorrect psychiatric perspective to evaluate Branch Davidians' responses, which caused them to over-rely on Koresh's statements that they would not commit suicide. According to Stone, this incorrect evaluation caused the FBI to not ask pertinent questions to Koresh and to others on the compound about whether they were planning a mass suicide. A more pertinent question would have been, what will you do if we tighten the noose around the compound in a show of overwhelming power, and using CS gas, force you to come out? Stone wrote, the tactical arm of federal law enforcement may conventionally think of the other side as a band of criminals or as a military force or, generically, as the aggressor. But the Branch Davidians were an unconventional group in an exalted, disturbed and desperate state of mind. They were devoted to David Koresh as the Lamb of God. They were willing to die defending themselves in an apocalyptic ending and, in the alternative, to kill themselves and their children. However, these were neither psychiatrically depressed, suicidal people nor cold-blooded killers. They were ready to risk death as a test of their faith. The psychology of such behavior, together with its religious significance for the Branch Davidians, was mistakenly evaluated, if not simply ignored, by those responsible for the FBI strategy of tightening the noose. The overwhelming show of force was not working in the way the tacticians supposed. It did not provoke the Branch Davidians to surrender, but it may have provoked David Koresh to order the mass suicide. Danforth Report. The Oklahoma City bombing on April 19, 1995, caused the media to revisit many of the questionable aspects of the government's actions at Waco, and many Americans who previously supported those actions began asking for an investigation of them. By 1999, as a result of certain aspects of the documentaries discussed below, as well as allegations made by advocates for Branch Davidians during litigation, public opinion held that the federal government had engaged in serious misconduct at Waco. A time poll conducted on August 26, 1999, for example, indicated that 61% of the public believed that federal law enforcement officials started the fire at the Branch Davidian complex. In September 1999, Attorney General Reno appointed former U.S. Senator John C. Danforth as special counsel to investigate the matter. In particular, the special counsel was directed to investigate charges that government agents started or spread the fire at the Mount Carmel complex, directed gunfire at the Branch Davidians, and unlawfully employed the armed forces of the United States. A year-long investigation ensued, during which the Office of the Special Counsel interviewed 10. In the final report to the Deputy Attorney General concerning the 1993 confrontation at the Mount Carmel complex, Waco, Texas, of November 8, 2000, Special Counsel Danforth concluded that the allegations were meritless. The report found, however, that certain government employees had failed to disclose during litigation against the Branch Davidians the use of pyrotechnic devices at the complex, and had obstructed the special counsel's investigation. Disciplinary action was pursued against those individuals. Allegations that the government started the fire were based largely on an FBI agent's having fired 3 pyrotechnic tear gas rounds, which are delivered with a charge that burns. The special counsel concluded that the rounds did not start or contribute to the spread of the fire, based on the finding that the FBI fired the rounds nearly 4 hours before the fire started at a concrete construction pit partially filled with water, 75 feet 23 m away and downwind from the main living quarters of the complex. The special counsel noted, by contrast, that recorded interceptions of Branch Davidian conversations included such statements as David said, "We have to get the fuel on, and so we light it first when they come in with the tank right as they are coming in." Some Branch Davidians who survived the fire acknowledged that other Branch Davidians started the fire. FBI agents witnessed Branch Davidians pouring fuel and igniting a fire and noted these observations contemporaneously. Lab analysis found accelerants on the clothing of Branch Davidians, and investigators found deliberately punctured fuel cans and a homemade torch at the site. Based on this evidence and testimony, the special counsel concluded that the fire was started by the Branch Davidians. Charges that government agents fired shots into the complex on April 19, 1993, were based on forward-looking infrared FLIR video recorded by the Night Stalker's aircraft. These tapes showed 57 flashes, with some occurring around government vehicles that were operating near the complex. The Office of Special Counsel conducted a field test of FLIR technology on March 19, 2000 to determine whether gunfire caused the flashes. The testing was conducted under a protocol agreed to and signed by attorneys and experts for the Branch Davidians and their families, as well as for the government. Analysis of the shape, duration, and location of the flashes indicated that they resulted from a reflection of debris on or around the complex, rather than gunfire. Additionally, an independent expert review of photography taken at the scene showed no people at or near the points from which the flashes emanated. Interviews of Branch Davidians, government witnesses, filmmakers, writers, and advocates for the Branch Davidians found that none had witnessed any government gunfire on April 19. None of the Branch Davidians who died on that day displayed evidence of having been struck by a high-velocity round, as would be expected had they been shot from outside of the complex by government sniper rifles or other assault weapons. Given this evidence, the special counsel concluded that the claim that government gunfire occurred on April 19, 1993, amounted to an unsupportable case based entirely upon flawed technological assumptions. The special counsel considered whether the use of active duty military at Waco violated the Posse Comitatus Act or the Military Assistance to Law Enforcement Act. These statutes generally prohibit direct military participation in law enforcement functions, but do not preclude indirect support such as lending equipment. The special counsel noted that the military provided extensive loans of equipment to the ATF and FBI, including, among other things, 2 tanks, the offensive capability of which had been disabled. Additionally, the military provided limited advice, training, and medical support. The special counsel concluded that these actions amounted to indirect military assistance within the bounds of applicable law. The Texas National Guard, in its state status, also provided substantial loans of military equipment, as well as performing reconnaissance flights over the Branch Davidian complex. Because the Posse Comitatus Act does not apply to the National Guard in its state status, the special counsel determined that the National Guard lawfully provided its assistance. Ramsey Clark, a former U.S. Attorney General, who represented several Branch Davidian survivors and relatives in a civil lawsuit, said that the report failed to address the obvious. History will clearly record, I believe, that these assaults on the Mount Carmel Church Center remain the greatest domestic law enforcement tragedy in the history of the United States. Equipment and manpower. Government agencies. Raid February 28, 75 federal agents ATF and FBI, 3 Sikorsky UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters manned by 10 Texas National Guard counter-drug personnel as distraction during the raid and filming. Ballistic protection equipment, fire retardant clothing, regular flashlights, regular cameras i.e. flash photography, pump-action shotguns and flashbang grenades, 9mm handguns, 9mm M5 submachine guns, 5.56 NATO M16 rifles, a 308-volt action sniper rifle. Siege March 1 through April 18, hundreds of federal agents, 2 Bell UH-1 Iroquois helicopters. Assault April 19, hundreds of federal agents, military vehicles with their normal weapon systems removed, 9 10 M3 Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, 4 5 M728 combat engineering vehicles CV armed with CS gas, 2 Moan Aeon Abrams main battle tanks, 1 Métis 8 tank retriever. Support 1 Britain Norman Defender surveillance aircraft. A number of Texas National Guard personnel for maintenance of military vehicles and training on the use of the vehicles and their support vehicles Humvees and flatbed trucks. Surveillance from Texas National Guard counter-drug UC-26 surveillance aircraft, and from Alabama National Guard. 3 Branch Davidians. The Branch Davidians were well armed with small arms, possessing 305 total firearms, including numerous rifles, semi-automatic AK-47s and AR-15s, shotguns, revolvers, and pistols. 46 semi-automatic firearms, modified to fire in fully automatic mode, included on above list. Other items found at the compound included about 1.9 million rounds of cooked-off ammunition, grenade launcher parts, flare launchers, gas masks and chemical warfare suits, night vision equipment, hundreds of practice hand grenade hulls and components, including more than 200 inert M31 practice rifle grenades, more than 100 modified. The ATF knew that the Branch Davidians had a pair of 50 caliber rifles, so they asked for Bradley armored vehicles which could resist that caliber. During the siege, Koresh said that he had weapons bigger than 50 rifles and that he could destroy the Bradleys, so they were supplemented with 2 Abrams tanks and 5 M728 vehicles. The Texas Rangers recovered at least two 50 caliber weapons from the remains of the compound. There is the question of whether the Branch Davidians fired the 50 caliber rifles during the raid or the assault. Various groups supporting gun bans, such as Handgun Control Incorporated and the Violence Policy Center, have claimed that the Branch Davidians had used 50 caliber rifles and that therefore these types of firearms should be banned. The ATF claims such rifles were used against ATF agents the day of the search. Several years later, the General Accounting Office, in response to a request from Henry Waxman, released a briefing paper titled Criminal Activity Associated with 50 caliber Semi-Automatic Rifles that repeated the ATF claims that the Branch Davidians used 50 caliber rifles during the search. FBI hostage rescue team snipers reported citing one of the weapons, readily identifiable by its distinctive muzzle brake, during the siege. Legacy. Oklahoma City bombing connection. Timothy McVeigh cited the Waco incident as a primary motivation for the Oklahoma City bombing, his April 19, 1995, truck bomb attack that destroyed the Alfred P. Murrah Federal Building, a U.S. government office complex in downtown Oklahoma City, and destroyed or damaged numerous other buildings in the vicinity. The attack claimed 168 lives, including 19 children under age 6, and left over 600 injured in the deadliest act of terrorism on U.S. soil before the September 11 attacks, and as of 2021, it remains the deadliest act of domestic terrorism in American history. Within days after the bombing, McVeigh and Terry Nichols were both taken into custody for their roles in the bombing. Investigators determined that the two were both sympathizers of an anti-government militia movement and that their motive was to avenge the government's handling of the Waco and Ruby Ridge incidents. McVeigh testified that he chose the date of April 19 because it was the second anniversary of the deadly fire at Mount Carmel. In March 1993, McVeigh drove from Arizona to Waco to observe the federal standoff. Along with other protesters, he was photographed by the FBI, and McVeigh himself was briefly interviewed by a television reporter. A courtroom reporter also claims to have later seen McVeigh outside the courthouse at Waco selling anti-government bumper stickers. Other events sharing the date of fire at Mount Carmel have been mentioned in discussions of the Wacko Siege. The April 20, 1999 Columbine High School massacre might have been timed to mark either an anniversary of the FBI assault at Waco or Adolf Hitler's birthday. Some of the connections appear coincidental. 8 years before the Waco fire, the ATF and FBI raided another compound of a religious cult, the Covenant, the Sword, and the Arm of the Lord. Some ATF agents who were present at that raid were present at Waco. April 19 was also the date from the American Revolution's opening battles. Montana Freeman Siege. The Montana Freemen became the center of public attention in 1996 when they engaged in a prolonged armed standoff with agents of the FBI. The Wacko Siege, as well as the 1992 incident between the Weaver family and the FBI at Ruby Ridge, Idaho, were still fresh in the public mind, and the FBI was extremely cautious and wanted to prevent a recurrence of those violent events. After 81 days of negotiations, the Freemen surrendered to authorities on June 14, 1996, without a loss of life. Media portrayals of Waco. The Wacko Siege has been the subject of numerous documentary films and books. The first film was a made-for-television docudrama film in the line of duty, Ambush in Waco, which was made during the siege, before the April 19 assault on the church, and presented the initial firefight of February 28, 1993 as an ambush. The film's writer, Phil Penningroth, has since disowned his screenplay as pro-ATF propaganda. Books. The first book about the incident was 1993's Inside the Cult, co-authored by ex-Branch Davidian Mark Brolt, who left the group in September 1989, and Martin King, who interviewed Koresh for Australian television in 1992. In July 1993, true crime author Clifford L. Leyendecker published his book Massacre at Waco, Texas. Shortly after, in 1994, a collection of 45 essays called From the Ashes, Making Sense of Waco was published about the events of Waco from various cultural, historical, and religious perspectives. The essays in the book include one by Michael Barkun that talked about how the Branch Davidians' behavior was consistent with other millenarian religious sects and how the use of the word cult is used to discredit religious organizations, one by James R. Lewis that claims a large amount of evidence that the FBI lit the fires, and many others. All of these perspectives are united in the belief that the deaths of the Branch Davidians at Waco could have been prevented, and that the popular demonization of non-traditional religious movements in the aftermath of Waco represents. The American novelist John Updike has been directly inspired by the Waco's events for the fourth and last part of his book In the Beauty of the Lilies 1996, which described how a troubled child could integrate such a sect. Documentaries. The first documentary films critical of the official versions were Waco, The Big Lie, and Waco Roman II, The Big Lie Continues, both produced by Linda Thompson in 1993. Thompson's films made several controversial allegations, the most notorious of which was her claim that footage of an armored vehicle breaking through the outer walls of the compound with an appearance of orange light on its front was showing a flamethrower attached to the vehicle, setting fire to the building. As a response to Thompson, Michael McNulty released footage to support his counterclaim. The vehicle is an M728 CV, which is not normally equipped with a flamethrower. McNulty accused Thompson of creative editing in his film Waco, an apparent deviation. Thompson worked from a VHS copy of the surveillance tape. McNulty was given access to a beta original. However, McNulty in turn was later accused of having digitally altered his footage, an allegation he denied. The next film was Day 51, the true story of Waco, produced in 1995 by Richard Mosley and featuring Ron Cole, a self-proclaimed militia member from Colorado who was later prosecuted for weapons violations. Thompson's and Mosley's films, along with extensive coverage given to the Wacko Siege on some talk radio shows, galvanized support for the Branch Davidians among some sections of the right, including the nascent militia movement, while critics on the left also denounced the government's siege on civil liberties grounds. Radio host and conspiracy theorist Alex Jones made his documentary film, America Wake Up or Waco, in 2000. In 1997, filmmakers Dan Gifford and Amy Summer produced their Emmy Award-winning documentary film, Waco, The Rules of Engagement, presenting a history of the Branch Davidian movement and a critical examination of the conduct of law enforcement, both leading up to the raid and through the aftermath of the fire. The film features footage of the congressional hearings on Waco and the juxtaposition of official government spokespeople with footage and evidence often directly contradicting the spokespeople. In the documentary, Dr. Edward Allard, who held patents on FLIR technology, maintained that flashes on the FBI infrared footage were consistent with a grenade launcher and automatic small arms fire from FBI positions at the back of Waco. The Rules of Engagement was nominated for a 1997 Academy Award for Best Documentary and was followed by another film in 1999, Waco, A New Revelation. In 2001, another Michael McNulty documentary, the FLIR Project, researched the aerial thermal images recorded by the FBI and, using identical FLIR equipment, recreated the same results as were recorded by federal agencies April 19, 1993. Subsequent government-funded studies contend that the infrared evidence does not support the view that the FBI improperly used incendiary devices or fired on Branch Davidians. Infrared experts continue to disagree, and filmmaker Amy Summer stands by the original conclusions presented in Waco, The Rules of Engagement. The documentary The Assault on Waco was first aired in 2006 on the Discovery Channel, detailing the entire incident. A British-American documentary, Inside Waco, was produced jointly by Channel 4 and HBO in 2007, attempting to show what happened inside by piecing together accounts from the parties involved. The MSNBC documentary Witness to Waco was aired in 2009. Songs. Two heavy metal bands wrote songs about the Davidian standoff. Machine Head's Davidian opened their debut album Burn My Eyes, and Sepultura's Amen was the fourth track from their Chaos AD album. Native American activist Russell Means included a song about the siege on his 2007 album The Radical, titled Waco, The White Man's Wounded Knee. In 2011, British indie rock band The Indelicates released a concept album, David Koresh Superstar, about Koresh and the Wacko Siege. Personal accounts. Branch Davidian survivor David Koresh wrote his account of life in the group and of the siege in the book A Place Called Waco, published in 1999. His book served in part as the basis for the 2018 Paramount Network six-part television drama miniseries Waco, starring Michael Shannon as the FBI negotiator Gary Nosner and Taylor Kitsch as David Koresh. Developed by John Eric Dowdle and Drew Dowdle, it premiered on January 24, 2018. The City of God, a new American opera by Joshua Armenta, dramatized the negotiations between the FBI and Koresh, premiered in 2012, utilizing actual transcripts from the negotiations as well as biblical texts and hymns from the Davidian hymnal. In 2015, Retro Report released a mini-documentary looking back at Waco and how it has fueled many right-wing militias.